Chapter 9, The Iron River. The iron mines of Rabnoria did not look like Rome, they looked like a wound in the red clay of the eastern hills. Here, the land split into a deep, precipitous canyon where a tributary of the Danubius, the Ferrum, ran thick and reddish-brown with the tailings of the imperial smelting furnaces. Across this muddy torrent stretched the only crossing for 10 leagues. A massive, three-tiered timber bridge built by Trajan's engineers, its massive oak piers iron-shod to withstand the crushing weight of the spring ice flows. By the second hour of the afternoon, Marcus Valerius and his 58 surviving ghosts reached the western bank of the river. The 12 captured Thracian horses were lathered in white foam, their lungs rattling like dry hides. Behind them, across the open gravel flats of the moorland, the sky was no longer white. It was black with the dust of Ballomar's entire vanguard. The 16 horsemen who had escaped the stone track had led the king's hunters straight to the throat of the river. "The gate is locked, Centurion," Lucius the Gaul called down from the lead saddle. At the western entrance of the bridge stood a fortified timber toll gate. The imperial miners and the small garrison of 20 municipal guards had already fled south, leaving the heavy oak portcullis dropped into the granite slots of the foundation. "Quintus, take the axe," Marcus shouted, sliding off his white mount. His boots sank into the freezing red mud of the riverbank. "Shove the horses into the current, we don't let the barbarians have the meat. Legio, to the bridgehead." The architecture of the fire. The 48 foot soldiers formed a semicircle around the timber gatehouse, their backs to the rushing brown water. They had no scuta, no heavy spears, nothing but their short lindenwood bucklers and the 3 inches of Spanish steel remaining in their scabbards. Out of the tree line, 300 paces away, came the Marcomanni. They did not rush in a loose line this time. King Ballomar himself rode at their flank. A giant of a man with a gold-plated helmet shaped like an eagle's skull, his beard braided with imperial coins. Beside him rode 60 Ulfnar, the wolf-pelts, their bodies bare despite the sub-zero wind, their long bows made of seasoned yew wood already notched with black-feathered shafts. "They're lighting the tips," Varus called out, pointing his sword at the front rank of the barbarian archers. The wolfskins dipped their arrowheads into small bronze pots of boiling birch tar carried by their attendants. A moment later, a line of tiny, sputtering green flames erupted along the barbarian front. Twang! The sound was not a single note, it was a dry, heavy vibration that sounded like a carpet being beaten in an alleyway. A second later, the sky above the river was filled with 300 arched trails of black smoke and green fire. The arrows did not hit the shields. They hit the ancient, dried oak of Trajan's bridge. The birch tar bit deep into the splintered wood, the wind fanning the green sparks into roaring orange tongues of flame that climbed the timber railings within seconds. "They're burning the road out from under us," Quintus growled, his heavy iron axe slamming into the portcullis chains until the links sparkled with white sparks. "Let it burn," Marcus said, his right hand drawing his father's gladius. He stepped into the first rank, his dead left arm pressed tight against the purple-wrapped Codex Pannonica beneath his jerkin. "The fire needs wood to eat. It will take them 10 minutes to cross the flats before they can taste the water." The iron wall of the Ferrum. The Marcomanni vanguard hit the bridgehead like a red wave. Without the long pila to break their charge, the legionaries had to meet the weight of the barbarian longswords with nothing but their bare knuckles and the short rims of their linden bucklers. The collision was a horrific, deafening roar of wood splintering against iron bone. A giant Suebian warrior, his chest tattooed with the red runes of the Oder Valley, swung a heavy two-handed axe that clove Varus's linden buckler clean in half, the iron rim biting deep into the old Umbrian's collarbone. Varus did not fall backward. He used his dying momentum to drop his weight forward, wrapping his old, scarred arms around the German's thighs and dragging him down into the red mud. Before the warrior could rise, Lucius the Gaul was there, his short knife entering the German's armpit where the high coat met the flesh. Marcus stood in the center of the gateway, his blade moving in the narrow, precise boxes of the Capua drill. He did not look at the sky, nor at the green flames that were now licking at the timber rafters above his head. He looked only at the throats and the groins of the men who tried to cross the threshold. A Marcomanni noble, his bronze torque glinting through the smoke, thrust a long spear at Marcus's face. Marcus ducked his head an inch, letting the iron tip shear the bronze cheek guard from his helmet, and brought his gladius up in a brutal, diagonal cut that severed the noble's fingers from his ass shaft. As the man shrieked, Marcus stepped forward, his right boot landing on the noble's chest, and drove his steel down into the soft skin beneath the iron visor. "Hold the line!" Marcus screamed, his voice raw from the smoke. "The chain is giving. Forward, you dogs!" The breaking of the third tier. Behind them, a sharp, metallic clang echoed over the roar of the water. Quintus had finally shattered the main weight link of the portcullis. The heavy oak grate crashed down into the stone slots, its iron spikes biting 3 inches into the granite foundation, separating the 30 surviving legionaries from the northern bank. "Marcus!" Quintus roared from the other side of the oak bars. "The third tier is falling. The main beams are gone." The fire had done its work. The upper walkway of the bridge was a roaring funnel of white heat and black pine smoke, the massive oak supports groaning as the iron bolts melted in the charcoal. "Up!" Marcus commanded his remaining 32 men. "Climb the framework. We don't cross the top, we move through the lower timbers." The legionaries scrambled up the diagonal bracing beams of the bridge like sailors on a rigging line during a gale. Below them, on the western bank, the Marcomanni were hacking at the portcullis with their axes, their iron tips sparking uselessly against the seasoned Roman oak. King Ballomar rode his stallion right down to the edge of the red water, his eagle skull helmet pointing up at the lower timbers where Marcus was crawling. "Valerius," the king bellowed, his Latin clear and heavy, his voice cutting through the cracking of the burning timber. "You carry the dead man's ink. There are no legions within 20 leagues of this river. Drop the papers into the current, and I will let your men walk south to the olive trees." Marcus stopped on a smoking crossbeam 20 paces above the roaring brown foam of the Ferrum. He reached inside his hide jerkin, his fingers closing on the purple bundle. He did not drop it. He did not look down at the king. He looked at Quintus, who was waiting at the eastern end of the lower timber with his iron axe raised high above his shoulder. "Cut the stay chains, Quintus," Marcus called out, his voice quiet, almost lost in the whistling of the fire wind. "Marcus, you're still on the span," the big Optio shouted back, his face white beneath the soot. "The script doesn't have a winter cloak, Quintus," Marcus said, his right hand lifting his father's gladius in a final, rigid salute to the eastern sky. "Give the emperor his peace." Quintus didn't yell. He brought the heavy iron axe down on the main leadstay of the eastern pier with a single, desperate roar. The chain snapped with a sound like a thunderclap. The western 2 spans of Trajan's bridge tilted sideways, the burning oak timbers twisting along the grain before collapsing into the red, ice-choked waters of the Ferrum with a massive, cloud-like explosion of white steam and orange sparks. The river took them all. The living, the dead, and the iron, leaving nothing on the western bank but King Ballomar and 300 silent spears staring at the empty red water. Chapter 10, The Road to Carnuntum. The river Ferrum did not kill Marcus Valerius. It preserved him in a casing of red silt and mountain ice. When his head broke the surface 300 paces downstream, the world was a silent canvas of gray and white. The roaring furnace of the bridgehead was gone, replaced by the low, rhythmic clink-clink of river ice grinding against the shale banks. Marcus dragged himself onto a frozen gravel spit by his fingernails, his body shaking so violently that his teeth chipped against each other. He lay in the red mud for a long time, listening to his own rattling breath. His dead left arm was still bound to his ribs, but the skin beneath his hide jerkin felt tight, iron-hard, and heavy. He reached inside with his stiff right fingers. The purple wool was caked in frozen silt, but the calfskin pages of the Codex Pannonica were still there. The ink had blurred slightly at the margins, but the red lines, the secret paths, the mountain grain stores, the exposed flanks of Rome remained readable. "Marcus!" A voice wheezed from the reeds. Marcus did not pull his sword, he didn't have the strength. He crawled through the frozen mud toward a clump of black willows. There lay Quintus Flavius and Lucius the Gaul. Of the 70 veterans who had crossed the Danubius 5 days ago, they were the only ones the river had spat back out alive. Quintus's massive left leg was twisted at an unnatural angle below the knee, the bone splintered through his leather trousers, while Lucius had lost 3 fingers on his left hand to the river ice. The others? Marcus asked, his voice nothing but a dry whisper of frost. Lucius looked back at the red, rushing water of the tributary. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. 50 miles to Carnuntum, Quintus muttered, his face the color of wet lime as he used a broken birch branch to bind his shattered leg. On foot. Through the Wackerwald, the stone forest. Ballomar's horsemen will be across the river by dusk, Marcus. They'll hunt us by the blood from my boot. Marcus stood up, his joints popping like dry twigs in the sub-zero air. He reached down, gripped Quintus by the leather shoulder straps of his jerkin, and dragged the giant Optio to his feet. Then we don't bleed on the path, Marcus said. We walk on the rocks. The architecture of the hunt. For 3 days, the road to Carnuntum was not a road, it was a slow, agonizing crawl through a gray wilderness of frozen shale and stunted pines. They had no rations. Lucius used his hunting knife to scrape the sweet inner bark from the frozen birch trees, which they chewed until their gums bled black fluid. At night, they did not dare light a fire, they burrowed into the snow like field mice, their bodies pressed together in a desperate attempt to keep the blood from turning to ice inside their veins. Behind them, the hunt was relentless. King Ballomar had sent his personal tracker. A chatty prince named Segimundus, whose horsemen rode light Pannonian mares that could cross the crust of the snow without breaking the surface. Twice, Marcus saw the dark shapes of their scouts on the high ridges above them, their long wolfskin cloaks silhouetted against the pale yellow glare of the winter sun. On the 4th morning, the winter finally broke the Gaul. Lucius collapsed into a drift of fresh powder at the base of a limestone crag, his eyes wide and glassy, fixed on the gray sky. His black, frost-bitten fingers were curled tightly around the hilt of his hunting knife. "Leave me, Centurion," the tracker whispered, a thin line of red foam bubbling on his split lips. The birds are already sitting in the trees. They've been following my shadow since the river." Marcus knelt beside him, his right hand moving to the Gaul's throat. The pulse was thin, fast, like the fluttering of a trapped sparrow. "You're a soldier of the 14th Gemina," Lucius Marcus said, his voice flat and merciless. "You don't die in the dirt like a provincial dog. You die on the line." "There is no line, Marcus," Quintus said, leaning heavily against his birch crutch, his breath rising in a thick white cloud. He pointed down the narrow canyon ahead. Through the gray mist of the valley came the low, brassy drone of a single carnix. Segimundus's scouts had closed the exit of the canyon. 8 horsemen stood on the hard-packed snow of the trail, their long spears pointed down at the 3 freezing Romans. The last watch of the 14. Marcus did not look at the horsemen. He looked down at his own right hand. The skin was blackened by the frost, the knuckles raw where the iron rim of his buckler had beaten against them during the bridge fight. He reached inside his hide jerkin and pulled out the Codex Pannonica. He did not open it. He placed the purple-wrapped bundle into Lucius's frozen right hand, closing the Gaul's black fingers over the imperial cloth. "Take it," Marcus commanded the tracker. "Centurion." Lucius wheezed. "You can crawl faster than Quintus can walk," Marcus said, his voice dropping into that quiet, cold rasp that left no room for argument. "The canyon walls are narrow here. The horsemen can only come 2 at a time. Quintus and I will hold the throat of the crag. You take the high sheep track behind the limestone. If you see the eagles of Carnuntum, you give the maps to the first officer you see." Marcus stood up, turned his back on the tracker, and drew his father's gladius. The steel was notched, stained with the red silt of the ferrum, but it was still straight. Quintus Flavius dropped his birch crutch into the snow. He stood on his one good leg, his right shoulder leaning against the solid limestone wall of the canyon, his heavy iron axe gripped in both hands. 20 years under the eagle, Marcus, the big Optio said, a dark, terrible smile breaking through the soot on his face. 20 winters, Quintus, Marcus replied, stepping up beside him until their shoulders touched. Down the canyon trail, the 8 Marcomanni horsemen spurred their mounts into a gallop, their iron spear tips glinting through the whiteness like stars. Behind them, in the deep snow of the mountain slope, the slow, dragging sound of Lucius crawling through the drifts began, a long, thin line of red blood tracking his path toward the east. Marcus lifted his sword to his chin, his gray eyes fixing on the lead horseman's throat. Legio. Marcus whispered into the freezing wind. Halt! Chapter 11, The Red Field. The snow outside the walls of Carnuntum was not white, it was the color of a wet iron anvil. For 2 days, the main winter base of the 14th Legion Gemina had been surrounded by a silent, white world that smelled of wet horsehide and grease. Inside the praetorium, a charcoal brazier burned with a low, green flame, casting a flickering light across the tired, gray face of Marcus Aurelius. The emperor was 60 winters old. He sat in a folding camp chair of purple ashwood, a heavy wool cloak wrapped tightly around his thin shoulders. His fingers, long and stained with the black ink of his philosophical journals, were tracing the faded red lines of a caked, blood-stained piece of calfskin that lay on the cedar table before him. The Codex Pannonica had arrived 3 hours ago. It had been delivered not by a Centurion, but by a freezing, half-mad Gallic tracker who had crawled the last 3 miles on his knees, his frozen fingers so stiffly locked around the purple cloth that the military tribunes had been forced to cut the wool away with their knives. The line at the 3 fens is open, the emperor murmured, his voice quiet, carrying the precise, dry cadence of the Athenian schools. He looked up at his senior legate, Pertinax. Ballomar knows our 3rd cohort is short of iron. He was planning to turn our flank at the iron mines before the winter solstice. The Centurion Valerius held the bridgehead long enough for the ink to dry, sire, Pertinax said, his hand resting on the heavy bronze pommel of his spada. But the scouts report that the king has already crossed the Ferrum. He has 3,000 spears of the United Tribes behind his eagle skull banner. They are less than a league from the northern gate. The emperor stood up, his joints popping softly in the cold room. He did not look at his sword. He looked out the narrow window slit at the vast, open plain that rolled down from the limestone hills toward the Danubius. Then we do not wait for the spring, Pertinax, Marcus Aurelius said softly. The old man Valerius gave us the map of their hunger. Let us see how they fight when we meet them on the stonework. The architecture of the machine. The deployment of the Roman army was done without a sound. At the 3rd watch of the morning, the 3 great iron-studded gates of Carnuntum swung inward. Out into the freezing grey mist marched 12,000 men, the full strength of the 14th Gemina and the 1st Adiatrix. They were not the frontier dogs Marcus had led through the fens. These were the regular battle cohorts. Men clad in pristine larica segmentata that gleamed like fresh silver, their rectangular shields painted with the deep scarlet and gold thunderbolts of the state. They moved in perfect, rhythmic squares, the heavy thud-thud of their iron-shod callagi packing the fresh snow into a solid sheet of gray ice. Marcus Valerius sat on an upturned wicker basket in the rear of the 2nd cohort. He had survived the throat of the canyon. The Thracian horsemen had not killed him. They had broken 3 more ribs and left him for dead in the drift, but the scouts of the 1st Legion had found him and Quintus clutched together like frozen logs beneath a limestone overhang. His dead left arm was now bound inside a hard splint of shaved ashwood, and his right hand was wrapped in thick linen strips that smelled of horse fat. You should be in the hospital tents at a quincum, old man, Quintus Flavius muttered from the box beside him. The big Optio's left leg had been amputated at the knee by the camp surgeons 2 nights ago. He sat with a short, iron-shod timber stump strapped to his thigh, his hand resting on a fresh pilum. The hospital is for men who have a home to go to, Quintus, Marcus said, his gray eyes fixing on the white line of the horizon. Rome doesn't have enough iron left to guard my grave if we lose the gate today. The clash of the 2 worlds. The Marcomanni came out of the northern pine woods at midday. They were no longer a vanguard, they were an entire nation on the move. 3,000 warriors, Chatti, Quadi, and Hermunduri, marched under the great eagle skull banner of King Ballomar. They came in a vast, chaotic crescent, their long swords hitting their heavy linden bucklers with a sound that sounded like a forest being felled by axes. Buccini. The Roman horns blew a sharp, brassy note that flattened the whistling of the north wind. The 12,000 legionaries did not advance. They stood in 3 long, silver lines across the flat ground, their shields locked from edge to edge, a wall of wood and iron bronze that looked like the foundation of a city. First rank. Pila, the tribunes shouted down the line. 6,000 heavy throwing javelins rose into the gray sky at once. They did not arch like the barbarian arrows, they flew flat and hard, a low cloud of iron teeth that hit the Marcomanni front rank at 100 paces. The results were catastrophic. The soft iron points of the pila bit through the barbarian bucklers, bending upon impact, dragging the wooden shields down to the snow. The front line of the tribes collapsed into a screaming mass of tangled limbs and broken wood, but the weight of the thousands behind them pushed the survivors forward over the bodies of their brothers. Then the two walls met. The collision was a physical shock that Marcus felt through the wicker basket beneath his thighs. It was the sound of an iron mountain hitting an oak forest. The Roman line groaned, the silver plates of the lorica grinding together as the first rank braced their shoulders against the inside of their scuta. The work of the silt. They're breaking through the third cohort. Lucius the Gaul called out from the snow beside Marcus. The tracker's face was bound in grease rags, but his remaining hand was locked around a short hunting spear. King Ballomar had found the weak spot. The very gap that Marcus's maps had warned the emperor about. The king's personal guard, the bare-chested Lfnar, had driven a heavy wedge of iron axes straight into the joint between the 14th Legion and the provincial auxiliaries. Marcus stood up, his boots sliding once on the bloody ice before his heels found the rockwork. He did not have a shield. He did not have a helmet. He had nothing but his father's notched gladius in his right linen-wrapped fingers. 14th. Marcus roared, his voice cutting through the scream of the warhorns with the rasp of an old iron file. To the flank. Ad signum. The 30 survivors of the frontier camps, the remnants who had returned from the fens, moved with him. They did not form a wedge, they formed a small, tight circle of cold steel that thrust itself straight into the side of Ballomar's charging column. Marcus moved into the smoke. He did not look at the grand scale of the battle. He looked only at the spaces between the barbarian ribs. A chatty warrior swung a heavy longsword at Marcus's head, but the old Centurion stepped under the arc, his short blade entering the man's thigh from below, severing the great artery. As the warrior dropped, Marcus used his right knee to drive the man's head into the hard snow, his sword already moving to meet the next throat. Beside him, Quintus was balanced on his single iron-shod timber stump, his heavy axe swinging in short, brutal circles that cleared a 3-pace space around the wicker box. Every time a German sword hit his iron-plated shoulder, the big Optio just laughed, a dark, rattling sound that smelled of sour wine and blood. Through the red mist of the fighting, Marcus saw the gold-plated eagle skull helmet. King Ballomar was 10 paces away, his long sword dripping with the blood of a Roman tribune, his slate-gray eyes fixing on the old Centurion who had stolen his maps from the blood altars. Valerius, the king, screamed over the roar of the shields. Marcus lifted his father's blade, his gray eyes turning the color of the winter sky. The script is finished, King, Marcus said. Now we check the count. Chapter 12, The Emperor's Peace. The sleet came at the 3rd hour of the afternoon, turning the red field into a mirror of black ice and red slush. The weight of 12,000 men had ground the Pannonian snow into mud, but the iron discipline of Rome was a machine that did not slip. On the right flank, the 1st Legion Adiatrix had completed its wheeling maneuver, their lines locking the Marcomanni crescent into a tight, 3-sided vice that squeezed the life out of the tribes pace by pace. But in the center, between the shattered standards of the 3rd cohort, there was no machine. There were only 2 men standing on a mound of the slain. King Ballomar did not swing his longsword with the wild fury of his chieftains. He moved with the slow, calculated precision of a man who had hunted wolves in the high Carpathians for 30 winters. His eagle skull helmet was splattered with the brains of a Roman primus pilus, and his breathing was a heavy, rhythmic wheeze through his gold-braided beard. You should have let the river have you, Valerius, the king said, his Latin clear as a temple bell over the screaming of the wounded. He lifted his heavy Suebian blade, the tip pointed straight at Marcus's throat. Your emperor will give this dirt back to us before the cherries bloom. He is a man of words. I am a man of iron. The emperor writes his words in ink, King, Marcus said, his right hand tightening on his father's gladius. The linen wrappings around his knuckles were soaked through with black blood, his breath coming in short, agonizing gasps that tasted of iron rust. But the Legion writes them in the stone. The last duel of the iron frontier. The king lunged first. It was a low, sweeping cut aimed at Marcus's shattered left knee, the exact weak side that the ashwood splint couldn't protect. Marcus couldn't parry with a shield, so he did what he had done at the stone track. He dropped his weight straight into the slush, letting the long blade whistle through the air 2 inches above his iron skullcap. As the king's momentum carried him forward, Marcus brought his short blade up in a vicious, vertical thrust meant for the groin. But Ballomar was too fast. He slammed the bronze boss of his linden buckler down onto Marcus's right forearm, shattering the linen-wrapped bones with a sound like a dry branch snapping. The gladius clattered into the red mud, its ivory pommel slipping down into the slush. Marcus collapsed onto his back, his breath gone, his face looking up at the gray, uncaring sky of Pannonia. The king stood over him, his massive boots pinning Marcus's dead left shoulder into the dirt. He raised his longsword with both hands, the iron tip pointing down at the center of the Centurion's scarred throat. "The maps are mine, Roman," Ballomar whispered, his slate-gray eyes wide with the dark triumph of the north. "Not today, German," a voice growled from the smoke. Quintus Flavius did not charge on 2 legs. He crawled out of the heap of the dead like a broken mountain cat, his single iron-shod timber stump dragging through the mud behind him. With a final, desperate roar that emptied his lungs of blood, the big Optio swung his heavy iron axe not at the king's shield, but at the Thracian stallion's bridle charm that still hung from Ballomar's belt leather. The heavy iron head didn't hit the gold, it caught the king square across the back of his kneecap, shattering the bone into white splinters. Ballomar shrieked, his giant frame buckling as his right leg gave way, throwing him sideways into the slush beside Marcus. The law of the camp. Marcus did not wait for his right hand to heal. He didn't need his fingers to kill. He used his teeth to rip the linen bindings from his broken right wrist, then reached down with his left his dead, shattered arm that had been frozen since the fens, and found the ivory pommel of his father's gladius in the mud. The pain of forcing his torn shoulder muscles to move was a white flash that blinded his eyes for a heartbeat, but the old iron machine inside him did not care for the flesh. Marcus threw his weight over the fallen king, his knee pinning Ballomar's gold-plated helmet into the mud, and drove the 3 inches of Spanish steel straight through the soft skin beneath the king's bronze collar torque. The blade went in clean, twisted once, and came away red. The king of the north thrashed once, his fingers clawing uselessly at the iron plates of Marcus's lorica, then went as still as the limestone crags of the Three Sisters. Around them, the high, wild cries of the Marcomanni died into a long, mournful wail. The eagle skull banner fell into the red slush, trampled by the iron-shod soles of the advancing second cohort. The Emperor's peace. 2 hours later, the twilight came down over Carnuntum, thin and cold and smelling of old charcoal. Marcus Aurelius walked across the battlefield alone, his purple-bordered toga dragged through the red mud of the trenches. He did not carry a sword, he carried a small bronze stylus and a fresh tablet of black wax. He stopped by the wicker basket where Marcus Valerius sat, his broken arms bound in clean white linen by the Greek surgeons. Beside him lay the body of Quintus Flavius, wrapped in the scarlet cloak of an officer, his hands still locked around the shaft of his broken axe. "The tracker Lucius will live, Centurion," the emperor said, his quiet voice carrying no triumph, only the deep, historical weight of a man who knew the cost of every line on his maps. "The Codex Pannonica has been sent back to the Senate at Rome. The border will remain on the Danubius for another 100 years. Marcus looked up at the old philosopher, his gray eyes turning toward the north, where the dark, endless wall of the Germanic forest was already being swallowed by the winter night. "The border isn't on the river, Caesar," Marcus rumbled, his voice dropping into that final, cold rasp of the frontier. He reached down with his stiff fingers, picking up a handful of the red mud from the field and letting it slide through his bandages back into the dirt. "The border is right here," the Centurion whispered. "It's wherever we leave the iron."